You're listening to the Valley Current.
Hey, welcome in, Len, to the Valley Current. I really appreciate you being super on time, and dealing with scheduling is always a problem, but you've been just a champ about making your schedule available, so I want to thank you for that. You're looking younger and younger every time I see you, Len. Tell me, how are you doing that?
Well, because it's impossible, I'm not doing it.
It's impossible to be younger and younger?
Of course.
There's no possibility of looking younger and younger?
There's no way of determining age by sight.
If someone looks younger, that could be right, that could be wrong, but that's not about actually measuring it. That's just about observing an optical illusion to some degree, right?
It's whatever variables an individual uses to determine age. And most of us are able to do that. In fact, it is pretty remarkable, at least for youthful ages and maybe middle adult ages, how accurate people can be in respect to determining age within a few years in the case of very, very young people, and 5 or 10 years in the case of middle-aged people. But that's just based on experience. In fact, there is, unfortunately, no way of determining a person's biological age. That's one of the chief crippling impediments to research in the field of aging. Chronological age, or the ages that you celebrate on your birthday, those are useless markers for determining actual biological age. They're simply two completely different things.
Well, why is it that as a society we have not had some sort of metric around biological age, and rather we just go with chronological age? Are we just too lazy to try to imagine some set of metrics around biological age?
Well, the facts are more complicated than a simple response to that question. And that complexity is based on a very important fact that is not understood not only by non-professional gerontologists, but in my view, not understood by most gerontologists themselves. And that is that there has been very little, if any, and I say that with 55 years or 60 years, I think it is now, experience in the field of aging, that little, if any, work has ever been done on the greatest risk factor for all age-associated diseases. And that risk factor is age. There is, even to this day, microscopic, even if it's maybe at the level of the electron microscopic, amount of attention and money and research efforts to discover the difference between old cells and young cells. The etiology of aging, which is the greatest risk factor for the diseases that most of us are going to succumb to, is unexplored. It is a scandal, in my view.
Do you have in mind some of the reasons why? Is it against the interests of big pharma to spend some research dollars? Because it's very clear that big pharma will get behind anything that has a notion of a drug delivery associated with it that can be put in capsule or other deliverable form. Is there just too much of the economics wrapped up into the silver bullet of a capsule or other type of deliverable drug that big pharma can get behind, and anything less than that just will not be accepted? Because I do want to mention this before I forget it, I do remember years ago, I'm not sure if they're still in business, there was a company that launched a website called Real Age, RealAge.com. They changed their name. I just typed in realage.com. They changed their name to ShareCare. I'm guessing because they probably went out of business as Real Age. I'm just guessing. I mean, I don't know if you ever heard of them before, but I'll show you the website really fast and you could tell me whether, this was a company you ever heard of. But this is the website. I'm putting it up for you to look at. the first step to growing younger, if you type in realage.com, they talk about, like, they've turned it into something called share care. This is the first time I've seen it. They have things like health tools, and they have a list of Ask MD and a bunch of stuff. But Real Age was a interview format that if you answered about, it used to be like 100 questions. I'm sure they probably shortened it. You created a logon, and you literally would get what they called an assessment, a scientifically based assessment that shows you the true age of the body you're living in and the first step towards improving your well-being. Did you ever hear of these guys before at all, Len? Because I heard of them 10 years ago, and they weren't getting very much traction. You could see what they do. They ask you to put a bunch of data in, and they say that they will give you some sort of indication of their age. We don't have any sponsors. There's no advertising. This comes to mind just because in general, I think that this idea of having a biological age is a great idea, but I also think there are a lot of people that get worried about maybe even finding out what their biological age is. I'm going to put in some data here and see what it does as we talk, but just give me the sense of your sense of a system like this. Is it justified? Is it not justified? Or how do you think about it?
I've never heard of this company, but there are many, many companies and even academic institutions that have made approaches like that. None of them have ever been successful, and none of them ever will be successful.
And the reason you don't think they'll ever be successful is because you think that it's just not scientifically based, that sort of thing?
Well, you can't determine biological age by answering a bunch of questions about lifestyle. It's just completely impossible. You can only determine biological age if, in fact, you want to determine it, and people have made many efforts, is by looking at the biology. But even those efforts have failed. We have no reliable biological method of determining biological age. It's that simple. In respect to your earlier question about the focus of big pharma on aging, there is no pill that will reverse or decelerate or stop the aging process, because aging is a problem in physics and not biology. However, having said that, there are approaches to hopefully understanding the changes that occur in molecules of old cells that differ from the molecules in young cells that could benefit us in a very serious way in respect to resolving age-associated diseases. And that simply depends on the physics of the molecules that are found in old cells and not young cells, or their configuration, or the reason why they are dysfunctional, or the reason why biological pathways that can be determined in terms of physical structure. And once learning, for example, what the architecture is of molecules, or perhaps just clusters of molecules in old cells. And incidentally, we have ways of doing that. This is not a pipe dream. There are technologies available to do what I'm describing. If you can understand the state, for example, of dysfunctional molecules that remain in old cells, or if there are none in old cells, how they have disappeared. You also could find out the status of repair systems, which are composed of the same kinds of complex molecules that repair systems are known to repair in animals. Once knowing what those configurations are, you can then perhaps get a clue as to why those molecular configurations or status of dysfunctional molecules that exist in old and not young cells increase vulnerability to age-associated diseases. It could be, by that reasoning, that there is a similar or identical arrangement of old molecules, if I can use that short descriptive term, that allows for the susceptibility of older animals to age-associated diseases. And there could therefore be a common cause for all age-associated diseases. That means cancer, cardiovascular disease, stroke, Alzheimer's, etc. It is not illogical to believe that the molecular status, whether it's in terms of architecture or numbers of dysfunctional molecules, to argue that that status found in old cells or cells at the end or near the end of their lineage that make them different from younger cells, that could provide enormous insights into why vulnerability increases, as it definitely does, too old to increase the presence or vulnerability of age-associated diseases. This is all in spite of a mantra that virtually every physician utters upon awakening in the morning. And that mantra that you will find printed in the first paragraph of the papers published by geriatricians and spoken in the first paragraph of the speeches they give is this: the greatest risk factor for, and you can insert whatever age-associated disease you want, the greatest risk factor for age-associated diseases is age. Well, why aren't we doing research on the fundamental physics of aging?
Well, is the answer to that question that the culture of biology is a silo separate from the culture of the laws of physics, and people who do the laws of physics are interested in, black holes and quarks and things like that, and they don't think of an area like biophysics, or they don't think of biological, the underlying physics laws associated with biology? Like there's a siloing, just the way I think you would say and have, that medicine and medical doctors are not biologists, and they're not really trained in biology. They do a little bit of smattering of biology here and there. They do a smattering of organic chemistry. They do a smattering of maybe other topics in the field, but they are fundamentally mechanics that know how to work on cars that are called human bodies. I hate to put it that way because it makes them sound like mechanics, but at times you have implied to me that they really are not scientists any more than a lawyer is a scientist. A lawyer could be a scientist, but you don't study science when you do law. You study law, and you learn statutory law, and you learn common law. I think when you study medicine, you learn body parts. You learn about, areas of the body. And now we have specialists all over the body. People that deal with feet, called podiatrists. People that deal with hands. I don't know what they're called. They probably have a name. People that deal with skin, right? They're called dermatologists and so on, correct? Or do you think I'm wrong about that?
I think you're completely wrong.
Okay, tell me why.
The phenomenon of aging is not restricted to life forms. It also extends to inanimate objects. Everything that you and I and our listeners and viewers can see from where they're sitting or standing will age. There is a fundamental physical cause of age changes, and that physics is called the second law of thermodynamics, which is not, despite the name, difficult to understand. The second law says that energy tends to dissipate or spread out from where it originates, and unless it's constrained, energy will spread out. And that's the cause of the failures of bridges, buildings, airplanes, automobiles. The aging process in all of those inanimate objects is no different from the aging process in living in those animals that experience aging. There is a huge group of animals that either do not age at all, but more likely the process of aging in those animals is barely detectable by whatever measure you might invoke. But the fundamental principle is that aging is a universal process. It has no boundaries between biology and physics and inanimate objects. So that to argue that physicians are only looking at body parts, well, of course that's true, but most of them are not looking at the molecules that compose those body parts, nor are they ever looking at the way those molecules change in respect to how they behave with the passage of time. And that is, they lose, that the second law applies. It's not a difficult concept. And the failure to recognize this is, in my judgment, scandalous.
Right. I'm trying to figure out, though, why that's the case. You're a proponent clearly of the view that that should be part of the study that goes on all the time, right?
Well, no, I don't think it should be a part of the curriculum of a physician. I think it's more the provenance of researchers who are interested in the aging process, and there are many people who are interested in the aging process, but none of them are either interested in or can find the resources for studying the etiology or the cause of aging. And that statement applies to every institution and organization in this country and in the rest of the world that has the word aging in its title, including the National Institute on Aging, of which I'm a founding member. It includes the American Federation for Aging Research. It includes every organization that deals with age-associated diseases, and I listed them earlier, none of whom are studying or encouraging the study of the etiology or the cause of aging. If that isn't a scandal, I don't know what the definition of that term is.
Well, if you had unlimited federal money to create a chair at some university for this, maybe that's how it would start, but you tell me how it would start. Would you say, well, the way to get started is to actually put in a department, I don't know what you want to call that chair, I guess I'd call it the Leonard Hayflick chair for the study of the laws of physics applicable to aging, and then I would put that at some university. I suppose you would say, what, UCSF, which is where you were, or at Stanford where you were, or would you put it somewhere else? I'm just curious.
Well, there are mechanisms that exist today for doing that job immediately. At the National Institute on Aging, for example, and there are other examples that could be given, there is such a phenomenon known as an RFP, which stands for requests for proposals. The leaders at the NIA frequently come up with ideas that may be submitted to them from the general public or from the scientific community that encourages them to seek researchers to submit grants for specific areas of research. All they have to do is mount an effort to ask to have requests for proposals submitted to the NIA now to study the etiology of aging. It's so simple. A high school student could do this very simply if they had the resources to support the effort.
But let me repeat that question. What's stopping it? Like, I would think of somebody who is a postdoc interested very much in what might be called lifestyle medicine, if they're a postdoc in the medical field, or if they're a postdoc in biology. Assuming you were taking graduate students, which I know you aren't, but if you were, I would assume they would say, Len, you have a lot of wisdom. tell me what I should be looking at, and let's figure out a game plan for turning your views about the understudied areas into views about now we're starting to cook with gas in looking at these areas instead of wasting so much time and money on things that are irrelevant. Like, I think you said a huge amount of money is spent on Alzheimer's, right? I think if I remember an earlier discussion, you thought the amount of money that was spent on Alzheimer's. I learned this morning from a company that was pitching our side venture fund this morning that Alzheimer's research, basically, the money's all been thrown away. Everything's failed on Alzheimer's. Like, there's been no success anywhere, period, full stop. Like, from whatever date money started to get thrown at that, nothing has produced anything of any value, period, full stop. Like, every dollar is, I mean, maybe some doors have been closed, which of course is always valuable, but there's really been nothing that has shown any promise. Maybe that's an overstatement because they were pitching their own approach, what they said was new and exciting and so on. I could share those slides with you if you're interested. I know you're not. I don't think you're interested in Alzheimer's, but if you were, but I'm curious, how do you think and compare all the money that's been spent on Alzheimer's with what you would say is the understudied area of the laws of physics applicable to aging, right?
Well, I don't think that many Alzheimer's disease researchers or the Alzheimer's Disease Association or the National Institute of Neurological Diseases will argue with the statement that the one of, if not the greatest risk factor for Alzheimer's disease is aging. It is not a major discovery for me to say that Alzheimer's disease is more associated with older ages than it is with the younger ages. I think we all understand that. So the question is, in the, I believe it's 40 years of the existence of the Alzheimer's Disease Association, they have spent close now today to $1.5 billion, that's with a B, in the past 40 years, on Alzheimer's disease research and care and education and other elements. But they have spent nothing that I can detect, and I have looked at their websites, I've communicated with their senior leaders. There is no effort to understand the etiology of the greatest risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, which, as I've said now maybe 10 times, is aging. Why are they not studying that?
Right.
That same argument applies to the cancer research community, to the stroke research community, to all age-associated disease communities. Why are they not studying the etiology of the greatest risk factor?
Right, but let me reframe it in a way that would probably be racy, but more interesting for our audience and for me. You're kind of saying indirectly, look, we have more studies out there about how cars rust over time than we have studies about how cells disintegrate with the passage of time. Is that a fair statement? I know it's a racy statement, but we have more studies in America about the process of rusting of metal in cars than we do about the equivalent, I'm calling it rusting, the disintegration of cells over time vis-a-vis the law of physics. There's more studies of the former than there are of the latter. Is that a racy way to put it, or would you correct it in some way? I'm trying to draw an analogy that you've drawn to everything eventually over time disintegrates based on entropy and the laws of physics, and in particular the second law. I use rust and cars as an example because I think that's true. I think you would say left out for a while or left anywhere for a while, a car will eventually evaporate and rust, right? A long enough period of time, right?
Well, what will rust, if we can use that general term, are metals.
Right.
But cars are made of more than just metals,
right,
as are most other inanimate objects.
right,
But changes occur over time with increasing entropy or the application of the second law. There is comparatively a huge literature on the aging of bridges and buildings and airplanes and metal fatigue and lots of other areas of inanimate object aging. And compared to the studies, if you can call them that, because they're virtually non-existent, on the aging of living forms, that is in respect to the etiology of aging in living forms, it is unbelievably, the difference is almost unimaginable. Now, the important point is that the available resources to studying aging in living forms is virtually non-existent for the reasons that I mentioned earlier, that there is no appreciation in the entire biomedical community for the simple extrapolation from what virtually every biomedical scientist believes, and that is that aging is the greatest risk factor, as I keep saying, for age-associated disease. There is some difficult to explain impediment to focusing on the etiology or the cause of aging in biological material. Of course, there are analogies with inanimate objects. You described one way of looking at it, but virtually, as I said earlier, virtually everything you can see from where you're sitting or standing will age. Entropy will increase over time. The Big Bang was the origin of the lowest form of entropy, and entropy has been increasing ever since. But we know more about what causes the aging in buildings and airplanes and bridges than we do about the etiology of aging in life forms.
Right. And so we're on the same page on that. And now what we're puzzling together, because I am puzzled, given all of the postdocs that are looking for great topics to engage in research and writing and so on, why that doesn't seem to be an area of interest. Instead, we have other areas of interest that maybe they're more economically motivated, and this is more like there's nothing you can do about it. The laws of physics are the laws of physics. All you do is delay the laws of physics. That's why people wrap up cars in cellophane if they want the cars to last a long time. There are people that want to store classic cars. They wrap them up and they put them into a hermetically sealed container, and they store them sometimes for decades on the hope that when they open up that bottle down the road, they'll have a beautiful 1910 Bentley that's worth in 2010, 100 years later, a lot of time, a lot of value, that sort of thing.
Well, it's inexplicable why the focus, or at least some fraction of research funds in the biomedical community, are not devoted to the etiology of aging. But I can tell you what answers I've had from people who are leaders in some of the fields that I mentioned.
Okay.
And the answers go something like this. If you're sitting in front of a congressional committee to help you obtain funds for your for your research division, like the NIH or some specific part of the NIH, or even some private foundation. The politicians or the decision makers sitting in front of you clearly understand why money is needed for Alzheimer's disease research, cancer research, stroke research, et cetera, because they have experienced those entities, in most cases, in a family member or a friend. But when you ask them for money on aging, they look at you with a great deal of puzzlement because they don't understand why that's needed, nor or why a pill will somehow reverse aging. It simply doesn't make sense to the decision makers, not only in Congress, but also in the leadership of the National Institute on Health, who makes no effort whatsoever to provide resources for the study of the etiology of aging. The National Institute on Aging had one personality recently who tried to, and succeeded to a large extent, to harness the energies of all of the NIH or most of the NIH institutes to meet together and hold meetings and conferences on why age-associated diseases exist. And they called that geroscience. Why a new name had to be invented to confuse everybody again with the pre-existing term of biogerontology is beyond my understanding. The only success that huge effort had was to invent a needless new term called geroscience, and more importantly, to have failed to provide any focus of effort to fund, including the NIA, where this effort started, to get the NIA to emphasize the need to study the fundamental biology of aging. I also should add something else that's very important. I do not want it to be understood that I oppose research on Alzheimer's disease or any other major disease. That is not my position. I can say, however, that when I looked at the data, and anybody is free to do this, if you resolve the cause of death attributed on death certificates to Alzheimer's disease, and then you do the math, which is a very simple process, not complicated, of determining what the increase in human longevity would be by curing, if I can use that unreliable term, or by eliminating Alzheimer's disease as a cause of death, you will add 19 days onto human longevity in this country.
That's not much.
Well, it makes an argument that even the resolution of all major causes of death, or I should say all causes of death written on death certificates, outside those that we cannot control, like suicides and homicides and wars and accidents, but eliminating the diseases that we think we can control, or the causes of death that we think we control, you cannot increase average human life expectancy beyond 92 years. Currently in this country, it is on average about 80 years. So resolving all causes of death, and here comes the key phrase, written on death certificates, will only increase human life expectation in this country to an average of 92 years, which means there will be many people living beyond 82 and many people dying before 82. But 82 will be the maximum average determined if all causes of death on death certificates were to be resolved. Now, that doesn't mean that we'll become immortal. What it means is that the underlying aging process will continue to occur, and we will have to invent new terms to explain the cause of death attributable, for example, to the loss of physiological capacity in some major organ. These concepts also have to be appreciated.
Right. As you were doing your presentation, I was typing in answers to about 100 questions on this real age thing and listening to you. And it really is worth doing, because I bet you would see that they've created quite an agenda of questions. You have to have a lot of detail, which I happen to have on my iPhone, like what your cholesterol level is and what your blood pressure is, which I did. And it says that my chronological age is 10 years older than my real age, according to them, that I'm actually younger by 10 years and 2 months. I'll send you this screen. In fact, I should put this screen on here for a second just to show you. You're going to crack up. You're going to crack up. You're going to say, wait a minute, that's a joke, Jack. That isn't real at all. But if you look at it, I'm now sharing it. You can look at the screen. This is from realage.com, which is now ShareCare, and it shows calendar age versus my real age, and it gives a list of things I can do: eat better, manage stress, move more, sleep better, join a challenge, do a bunch of stuff. Now, you might say that's all interesting, but not really relevant to the etiology that you're talking about here, correct?
Well, it's not only not interesting, it's foolish.
Okay.
Those measurement, your cholesterol values are going to vary day by day.
Right.
The other values are going to vary day by day. But there is no logical connection between those gross measurements. I'm using the term gross in the in the dictionary definition of the actual age changes that occur. There's simply no connection whatsoever.
Right.
There may be connection with the status of health, that is cardiovascular health, if you can call it that. But I should emphasize again that what you're reading, what you're looking at there is not new. Companies and academic institutions and people interested in aging have been doing that sort of thing for the 70 years now that I've been in this field, and the outcomes have been the same. The companies go belly up, the academic interest diminishes or disappears because it's not relevant. It has nothing to do with the fundamental aging process.
So let's pick this up next time.
Tune in next time on The Valley Current.